Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tolkien Collector's Guide YouTube channel. We're very happy today to have Peter Grybauskas as our guest. He was the editor of the Battle of Maldon, recently published by HarperCollins in the UK and forthcoming very soon in the US as well as his previous book, The Sense of Tales Untold. We're going to be talking with you, Peter, about all sorts of Tolkienist related things. But why don't you just take a quick moment and introduce yourselves to anybody who may not have come across your name before?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for having me, guys. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Maryland, where I teach Tolkien and some other things as well. And I got my start in serious Tolkien studies as an undergraduate student, actually working with Dr. Flieger, who will be familiar to many of you out there, I guess. One day you're a nobody, and the next you're one of the famousest of hobbits, all because of a beautiful helmet on a cover of a text that nobody reads, and starring a duke whose name nobody can pronounce. So there you have it.
I struggle to pronounce that. Absolutely. It sounds like from what I've been reading that this opportunity will come to the Battle of Maldon in a little bit, but it first started, I think, with your interactions with the estate and HarperCollins to get your previous book published. I think it's called a monograph, right? It's related to some graduate studies or work that you were doing. A Sense of Tales Untold, which is a fantastic read, by the way. I have a copy here as well. Let's get it so it's not too shiny. It's a very nice glossy hardcover, but I really enjoyed it. So, and that I'm assuming you were working on for a really long time. Like that didn't just happen overnight. So tell us a little bit about the process of working on that book.
Yeah, well, on and off for probably more than a decade, which is kind of nuts. But I mean, I'm teaching a full load at Maryland. I'm not a tenured professor expected to pump out cutting edge research. So I'm doing it really for my own enjoyment in a sick way. So it takes some time. And that project honestly began as really had its been an undergraduate thesis that I was working on with Dr. Flieger. And of course it expanded and shrank and was spun off in all kinds of directions over the years. But yeah, the homecoming actually is sort of the subject of the fourth chapter, I think, in that book, and it was certainly not initially part of the plan, but it surprised me, and I think in a nice way ended up sort of rounding out that volume and thinking about this particular idea of like omission in Tolkien's tales, and did sort of dovetail really nicely with some of the stuff I'm picking up in the new HarperCollins volume.
What got you pulled into Tolkien to begin with? What was your introduction to him and his works?
Everybody says 11 or 12 years old. And I think that's probably right for me too. I had older siblings at home who were pretty serious readers, and so I suppose I was really exposed to some of the Tolkien followers, Tolkien knockoffs, even before I got to the real deal. But I was sort of an avid reader of fantasy, of weird tales as a kid, and I suppose I really got hooked. Yeah, late in elementary school, reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time, and just sort of becoming a bit obsessed. And so reading it really every year since. And then I was in high school when the films came out. Was already established as a reader, so they didn't warp my sense of the story too much. But yeah, really, as an undergraduate student at Maryland, working with Dr. Flieger, that was the first time I had this inkling that like Tolkien studies was a thing, or this could be something perhaps more than a hobby or pastime.
That must have been fantastic working with Dr. Flieger. I'm jealous.
Yeah, that was pretty
Yeah.
lucky, pretty lucky break. Yeah.
It's interesting as well. She sort of she actually restarted it, as far as I'm concerned. Tolkien studies. She's the person who's responsible for it.
Yeah, I think her and Tom Shippey are probably
Yeah.
mostly responsible for it.
Yeah, there's some stuff happening, really really early on, but yeah, certainly her Splintered Light in the early '80s. That was the first maybe big book on the Silmarillion, especially. Yeah, yeah.
I'm chuckling. Let's got a comment here from Carl Hostetter who says,
Well, Carl would know.
Yeah, look, I even got a manga.
exactly. That's it's a passion project for all of us. I think
It certainly is.
Great.
So Peter, I read your book recently, the Tales Untold book, and I was surprised at just how like easy of a read it was. It's fantastically put together, so kudos on that. It's easy to grasp. A couple things. One of the early things that stood out to me was just the sense that as I was reading through, and you were pointing out all these different instances that Tolkien uses this device of scenes happening just off screen, and you don't really know too much about them. I'm interested to know more about what you found. You know, we know that Tolkien was a medievalist and that he was dealing with lots and lots of unfinished texts and unfinished things. Did you find in your research, or does the book have any parts of it where that would that sort of jumped off the page to you, that Tolkien was really influenced by his work with medieval texts and things that were unfinished?
Yeah, I'd say so. And I came to be sort of an honorary medievalist, really, in Tolkien, and I suppose I'm probably not alone in that. I imagine that many medieval departments are still hanging on by a thread because they read Tolkien when they were 12 or something. But yeah, certainly. I mean, everything from I think that Tolkien was drawn both to the sort of techniques that these sort of poets and authors that he loved were using, but also by the sort of accidental qualities of these texts that survive, but in maybe damaged form, right? Actually, there's a little bit from his Dragons talk, his New Year's Day talk in Oxford, I think 1938, that was included in the first edition facsimile. And there's some great stuff there. I certainly recommend it to anyone, but there's also his sort of like short, retelling of Beowulf for kids, so perhaps a little bit over their heads. And he really kind of gets into this, it's this sort of feverish excitement of creeping into the barrow and the stealing of the cup, and then he sort of pauses and said, like, and right here, unfortunately, the manuscript is terribly blotted and damaged. I just don't quite know what's going on there. Of course, in the case of Maldon, I have to think that one aspect of that poem that drew Tolkien in was the fact that it had no beginning or no end, right? That something about those fragments was certainly intoxicating for Tolkien.
Yeah, the fragments, they weren't there, were they, in the cotton like before it was burnt in the fire? The beginning and the end were all missing.
Yeah, all we have is I think 18th century copy, I want to say. Yeah, so
I think you're right, Peter.
And original manuscript for that poem.
So another question I have, that's great, Peter. That's very that gives me that definitely answers my question. The other thing I was thinking about when I was reading is you have a chapter in Sense of Tales Untold on the I believe you called the elusive web of the last alliance in the Lord of the Rings, and you have a quote in there. Hopefully, I'm quoting you correctly. You say so much of the story of the War of the Ring is about, and about Lord of the Rings is about war stories and like telling them and reading them and remembering them. That kind of struck me. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I guess maybe that emerged in a way on a reflection of like the viewing of some of the adaptation of Tolkien's work, right? Of course, much of this desire to see these great action set pieces, right, occupying the screen, and yet when you revisit the text, if action there is, so much of it takes place later, right, where we sit around the campfire and say, so what actually happened there? What were you up to? Or how was the battle, right? And so we have this sort of extra layer of mediation, right? So yeah, it was kind of a reflection of that, and I it doesn't really come out so much maybe in the book, but in some of the side projects I was engaged in at the time, I was thinking also about Tolkien's own war experience, of course, and his kind of touchy comment in the second edition forward, reacting against the reading that placed the book in the sort of obvious immediate context of the Second World War, but reminding people, of his own incredibly, harrowing experience serving in the First World War. So kind of that sense of distance and reflection on past experience. Of course, blown up over, 3,000-year period in the case of the separation between the War of the Ring and the Last Alliance. But still, I thought that was a theme that was worth kind of exploring further.
Yeah, it's interesting because I thought about, when I was reading that section, I thought about Frodo and Sam a lot, like when they're journeying through into Mordor. A lot of what Frodo and Sam are doing are reflecting on what other characters in Tolkien's stories have done, and they're reflecting on they're constantly comparing themselves to other, and Tolkien's constantly comparing them to other characters too.
Yeah, of course. Right, you have this really vividly drawn world, but it's also maybe primarily a world of stories, right? And some of the edges kind of touch and overlap, and others are sort of more out in space there. But yeah, certainly that sense of a whole web of tales and traditions is so, I don't know, so beautifully rendered in the Lord of the Rings, especially, but elsewhere in the Legendary too.
You talk in the new book, the Battle of Maldon. You talk about how it's been an influence, and there's fragments of it and other writings of Tolkien in your new volume that are in the Lord of the Rings that are related, or that he used as inspiration for readers who've read the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit but haven't gotten to your book yet, or haven't run across previous publications of some of the fragments that you've edited together in your book. What should pull them into reading your new volume? What's the connection there to the Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot. There's really quite a bit there. Of course, a text that's really reflecting on the conflict between war and sport, right, and the sort of heroic code. Okay, a text that's also looking back at this sort of interesting sort of inflection point here at the end of Old English poetry, right, and looking ahead to the Middle English period and the Norman Conquest and all this, but also sort of connecting in some interesting ways with the older poetry, right, with the traditions that are kind of captured in Beowulf, right. and then too in the sort of shape of it and the tension between romance and reality, right? Fantasy and realism. That we kind of see these positions occupied in the homecoming by our two main speakers, our characters in the drama. But that I think anyone who's reading The Lord of the Rings notices this kind of structure, unfolding in the separate books of that longer tale as well, right? That Frodo and Sam seem to be slogging through a really kind of grim and a sort of different kind of story than Merry and Pippin, right? Who get to swear themselves as knights to these great kings and have these strange and wonderful adventures, right? So I think, yeah, structurally and thematically, there's really quite a bit. I mean, I'm an English teacher, so I tend to fish for connections that aren't there. But I don't know. I find it difficult to unsee once you've given it a little bit of thought. And certainly that abiding interest of Tolkien's in the northern courage and that sort of desperate heroic stand, which he was both enamored with and also quite critical of. But that is playing out again all across the legendarium.
Peter, I wonder if since we're talking about the new book now, I wonder if you could give the viewers sort of who are not familiar with what like the contents of the book, or like what maybe the history around the battle, or if you could kind of tell people who are watching like what it, give us a short synopsis: Battle of Maldon, Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, the poem, like what are the because of a brief introduction to people who may be on the fence about the new book.
Sure. So
briefly, obviously, briefly.
Yeah, no. So really, I think maybe the best way to view this text is in terms of a kind of critical edition of Tolkien's Homecoming. Okay, but of course, Tolkien's Homecoming is completely inspired by and indebted to the Battle of Maldon. So, an historic battle, right, fought in the summer of the year 991 between English defenders and Viking invaders near Maldon in Essex. And that battle is recalled in several historical and apocryphal sources, but most memorably in this fragment of an Old English poem, which doesn't have a beginning or a title, but which we call the Battle of Maldon. So that text remains a sort of set piece in English schools and study of literature, and was certainly so for Tolkien, who studied it as an undergrad and later lectured on it at Oxford, especially while he was the Rawlinson Bosworth Chair at Pembroke College. So there's quite a bit of academic work, of course, that Tolkien did on this poem, including a prose translation, which I have published here in the new volume. But certainly Tolkien's most intriguing engagement with that poem, the Battle of Maldon, is his sometimes called the sequel, right? The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, which is actually a one-act play of a drama in verse, in alliterative verse, right? So in modern English, but imitating the meter that the original poem and that, of course, other works like Beowulf are written and composed in. And this sequel tells of the adventures of two servants of the fallen English leader. Okay, because I guess I should say spoilers here. The English lost the Battle of Maldon.
Oh no!
Yeah, I hope you're buying the book. So the English leader, who was very famous in his day, right? Tolkien calls him old and hoar and valiant and vigorous still, even though he's all white-bearded and white-headed, and has seen a lot of battle. He was also a great patron of the church, and so the abbot of Ely Abbey sends in Tolkien's drama sends two servants, which are inventions of Tolkien's here. So it's a kind of historical fiction too. Bertnoth actually is or was buried at Ely Abbey, and had this strong relationship and patronage with the church there. But these two servants go the night after the battle to do a little scavenging to try and recover the body of their sort of fallen leader. And so Tolkien's one-act verse drama is really great Halloween reading, honestly. It's incredibly spooky. It's two voices in the dark, okay, wandering through this sort of spent battlefield scene, uncovering bodies of men that they knew and loved, right? Looking for the headless corpse of the English leader Bertnoth, okay? They recover the body eventually and load it on the wagon and head home. But along the way, they have this kind of engaging sort of banter, this dialogue, and our characters are really richly drawn, and their voices come through really beautifully, especially when read aloud or when listening to the lovely audio recording that Tolkien made. But we have a younger man, Torthelm, who's the son of a poet, the son of a minstrel, and is clearly out of his depth, right? Is terrified, probably has never seen dead bodies or battle or fought in battle, certainly. And is sort of processing this all through the lens of the legends and the poems that he loved, right? And his older counterpart Tidwald, as a sort of grizzled old farmer who's seen battle and just wants to get home and have his dinner and just get on with it. So we have this great sort of tension between them. The one has a tendency to spontaneously burst into song and sing the praises of Bertnoth and compare him to the great, legendary warriors of old. And the other is much more sort of cynical and skeptical and more sort of focused on the awful waste and mess of battle, right? So of course they discuss they're kind of like reconstructing the battlefield that we can see the pitch battle unfolding in the original Old English poem, and they're also revisiting in particular this kind of pivotal moment that Tolkien takes up in an essay following his drama called Overmode, right, which is really a close study of the word that the poet uses to describe the English leader Bertnoth's decision, his decision to sort of cede this strategic advantage, because the Vikings are coming from north the Isle, so they're camped on an island and they need to reach the mainland to do battle. And they've only got this sort of single file strip of land because of the tides coming in. And so the English, of course, recognize and begin the battle by exploiting that. But the Vikings, as Tolkien says in his introduction, they start to practice a little bit of cunning, and they seem to recognize that, Bertnoth is a leader. I know how to talk to him. Let's tell him. Let's do a sort of more manly, a fair fight. Like, let's really have it out. And so he allows them to cross so they can have this great sporting battle. And unfortunately, right, the English Bertnoth is killed and his men are slaughtered. And the original poem spends most of the fragment that we have, at least the second half of it, is really like the famous last words of all the loyal men who decided to stay and fight beside their fallen lord, right? So they give some stirring speeches, they kill a Dane or two, and then they get slaughtered, right? And one by one they go, but it's of course primarily remembered as a celebration of this heroic ethos, this what the Roman historian Tacitus called the comitatus, right? The bonds between warrior retainers and the shame that's felt in sort of leaving the battlefield if your leader has fallen. Okay.
By the way, Peter, I love the Tacitus name drop. That's awesome.
Yeah. All right. I don't know if that. So that's sort of the Battle of Maldon, and that's sort of the frame for Tolkien's first drama, The Homecoming, and those are, of course, the two kind of centerpieces, I guess, in the new volume.
And we can get all that. We can get all that in the new book, right?
Yeah. So there's three central parts, and then a series of appendices for super fans, right? So the first part is really the Homecoming as it was originally published in an academic journal in 1953, and the second part is Tolkien's translation of the Battle of Maldon, the original poem, along with a selection of his really, I think, quite interesting notes about the language of the poem, its connection to Beowulf, the narrative of it, right? Some of these sort of themes that come out there, some of the characters that are featured in it. And the third part, I'm pleased that the publishers were willing to include it here. It's a long and I think pretty challenging sort of lecture essay that Tolkien wrote also in the 1930s called The Tradition of Versification in Old English. And it deals quite a bit with the meter and the language of the Battle of Maldon and sort of placing it in this longer tradition of Old English verse. But it also does some really makes some interesting comments about poetry and about tradition, about the practice of poets, and that sort of thing that I hope will be worth the read, worth the challenge. Certainly it'll be maybe the most skipped part of the volume, but if you are interested in Tolkien's academic work and want to read deeper, I think that you will be rewarded. And finally, it ends with some appendices that look at the development of the Homecoming, which went through a number of really interesting and sometimes revolutionary sort of iterations, from an early sort of rhyming scheme to the really beautifully rendered alliterative verse in the published version, and a few other sort of excerpts from Tolkien's academic work that kind of look into the recipe for Old English meter and some of the interesting quirks of the language in the Battle of Maldon. And finally, a short essay that I penned that attempts to kind of distill some of the connections between some of this medieval scholarship and, of course, the beloved stories that all kind of that drew us to Tolkien in the first place, right?
Yeah, I want to mention as well that you mentioned the atmospheric, lovely tone of the Homecoming of Bjorknoth, and Tolkien actually read and recorded that when he was playing around with the tape recorder. I believe it was the one he had borrowed from the university at this time, and HarperCollins has included Tolkien's own reading of that with the deluxe edition of your book, but it's also available as a separate audiobook from Audible, for example, for just a few dollars. I think it's like $4 or £3 to get that download, and the sound effects that he makes in his office and his voice and intonation and reading this is just fantastic. And I love the fact that your book has allowed this audio recording to be cleaned up and published for fans to hear again, because prior to this it was a cassette that was given out. I think there were 100 copies of it at the 1992 Centenary Conference, and it's very hard to come by. So I'm very happy that fans are.
He's great at owl noises. I think they're very impressive.
His owl, yeah.
His owl's very good. Yes.
Peter, did HarperCollins send you a copy of your the deluxe edition of your book?
Yes, yeah, I've got it.
Just want to make sure. Because we can talk to them if they didn't.
Yeah, they were very kind to send that along.
Very good.
Yeah, likewise, Jeremy. It's really very cool to see that bit of ephemera kind of widely available. I was 6 years old for when the Centenary Conference happened, so I missed out on that. But yeah, it is a really nice piece of lore, and I would say also a really beautiful kind of collaboration with father and son, and that Christopher Tolkien is reading the essays that kind of sandwich the verse drama Homecoming itself. It's very cool and worth a listen if you haven't yet heard it.
Yeah, I highly recommend tracking that down. Yeah, and speaking of libraries, you got a fantastic one behind you on the screen there. I mean, one of the focuses of our channel is book collecting, and it looks like you've got a bit of that bug.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, Peter, what do you got back there?
Oh, just some research stones. I don't know. I don't really consider myself a collector. I got little kids, man. I mean, I'm afraid they're gonna throw it anyway. But yeah, I suppose I've amassed most of a lot of Tolkien and some stuff. Also some stuff about Rome and Roman food. That's kind of my side gig that that I do. I say I teach the two F's, fantasy and food. But yeah, Tolkien adjacent material back there. So.
That's awesome. That's good.
Peter, I'm interested if something I thought about that hadn't occurred to me till just recently. I was reading through the new book, the Maldon book. Is there? So I know that Homecoming was published in 53, right? First in 53, and The Lord of the Rings is published the next year. Tolkien was working on the Homecoming and the Lord of the Rings together in tandem? What do you know anything about the timeline there? Is there any significance to the fact that they were published around the same time?
Yeah, it's certainly, those dates have always kind of intrigued me. I mean, as you know, of course, I mean, a publication date doesn't necessarily say much, right, especially about Tolkien's work, right? Which begins at the beginning, and often, he comes back to it when he can. So certainly you can see a full, 20 plus years from start to finish. And the Homecoming, more or less tracking, the work on, say, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, too. There's a great little a letter there, though, that when I think it comes out in the Hammond and Skull Companion, actually, but I may have quoted from it in the new volume, where Tolkien just sort of describes his elation one day of finding out two good bits of news, right? One is that they're going to publish my little verse drama about chivalry and common sense in the mouths of two fictitious Anglo-Saxons, and the other, even more unbelievable, a great heroic romance is going to be published, and that, of course, is the Lord of the Rings. So I don't know, and it may be a red herring, but I've always found that to be quite interesting, and certainly that's nudged me in the direction of trying to uncover maybe some more kind of interesting sort of at least thematic connections between the two. Certainly they're both products of, I mean, this is really great alliterative verse, actually, and really impressive, I guess, to come through exclusively in dialogue here. But you can see that he's learned quite a bit from some of the early experiments in trying to spruce up that, to trot out that meter in modern English, and of course it pays off in some of the really lovely verses in the Lord of the Rings too. Mm-hmm.
Do you think he actually tried to write it in Old English? Is there any evidence of that, or do we not know?
I didn't come across any of that. Of course, that wouldn't be that unusual. There's certainly nothing that I saw in the draft material would suggest that.
You spent a lot of time in the Bodleian when you were researching this book?
Yeah, well, one of the great perks of teaching some classes abroad there is to spend my free time in the library.
It's a pretty major perk.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I had read a little bit about the drafts of the Homecoming in Thomas Honegger's Tolkien Studies article, maybe 2006, I want to say.
Hmm.
But it's one thing to read about them, and it's another, of course, to see them for yourself. And so, yeah, digging into that archive and also, of course, the academic work on Malden, too, was what gave me the serious, idea to try to put together this sort of proposal and this sort of volume.
Did they give you access to everything you needed at the Bodleian, Peter, or was there some things that you requested that they wouldn't let you see?
No, I mean, Malden, I suppose, isn't exactly the Holy Grail, right?
Well,
But
yeah,
no,
yeah.
the state and the archivist, Catherine McElwain, was super helpful. And yeah, I mean, it was more than enough material to work with. I suppose, I mean, one of the challenges was to to pare things down and to try to present it in a way that hopefully will make sense to the interested reader, but not necessarily the highfalutin scholar, right?
Hmm. Was there stuff? I mean, obviously, paring down for comprehension and theme, etc. Some things didn't make it in just because they didn't reach that threshold. But is there material you ran across that you hope will see the light of day and get published someday by yourself or others?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in a more specialized way, and again, just even limiting ourselves to the material related to Malden. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot on the cutting floor, but again, I really wanted the Homecoming to be the beating heart of this volume, and to try to draw out where possible not so many of the technical, linguistic, and philological features, but more kind of the thematic connections that would be of interest to the readers of Tolkien's fantasy, right?
Yeah.
So is there more work to be done on Malden? Is there a volume 2 to your book, do you think?
I don't know. That's certain.
I'm
Yeah,
not rushing you or anything.
no, I'm working on a few things. I'm not even ready to share them with myself. Certainly not with you. Okay, we got millions of viewers right now. So, but no, I'm not anything specifically related to Malden at the moment. I am super excited, of course, to hear what people make of the new book, and what scholars will make of especially part 3, the essay, and all that. So yeah, we'll see what comes of it, but there's always more work to be done, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious if you have any views on this, but Beorfnoth, the way that it's spelled on the book, is that purely a Tolkien spelling? Because I don't seem to see it spelled that way by anybody else.
Yeah, it's kind of it's there's a note in the volume that there's a note from Tolkien, and there's a note also from Michael Drout, when they nicely corroborate each other here. But it's Tolkien's attempt to sort of reconstruct an older spelling, right? In the sense that most of our surviving manuscripts of old English poetry are West Saxonized, right? So yeah, it's certainly an idiosyncratic spelling, but it's meant to, suggest the origins of the name, or how it would have been pronounced to the to the people of this period, right?
You've got a book signing coming up in June. You've publicized that through Blackwell's, so I think that's very exciting for the UK and potentially European people, depending how shipping goes for visit. But you'll be teaching there, right? You've got some events coming up this summer that I think our viewers might be interested in.
Yeah. So the Blackwell signing is for sure, and I want to say, maybe is it July 10th? You got it there.
Let me pull up the calendar here.
Yeah, let me double check that. I don't want to mislead anyone.
It's in July, right?
Yeah,
July 10th is correct. Yep.
yeah. Okay, right. So yeah, I'll be at Blackwell's then, and in late June, I expect. I don't really have a announcement to make, but I'll be in Rome the third week of June, or around June 24th, I expect. Probably some kind of conference or event happening with some of the Italian Tolkienists there in Rome. So yeah, of course, if anyone can make it up to Oxford in July, I'd be happy to see you. Otherwise, it's going to be one of those Spinal Tap signings, you know.
Those are the best kind.
Nobody there, but that's okay. I'll take the cardboard cutout home and. Yeah, the big signing. It was huge.
You'll have fans there. I'm aware of a few people who want to be there, and I know that there are multiple people who can't make it, but I'm sure will work with Blackwell's to get signed copies. So they'll put a little stack in front of you if nothing else. I'm interested in getting one myself, so we'll see what we could figure out there as well. We've got 10-15 minutes left for the hour that we had arranged with you. I don't know how you're doing on time, but what have we not talked about that you want to share with people? You've had a long history with Tolkien. You're an excellent teacher. You do some classes. We've got this wonderful new HarperCollins volume that's coming out, but that's not all of you. So.
Well, yeah.
It sounds like you've got a few projects you're working on. Not something to talk about yet, but I don't get the sense that you're done with Tolkien yet.
No, he's not done with me, I guess.
Excellent.
He's not done with any of us.
Yeah. No, again, it's a side gig for me in a way. So I enjoy. I'm calling this moment, actually, ironically, my sabbatical, which does not mean that I'm off the hook for teaching, 4 sections of classes each semester, but it just means I'm also not writing a book actively at the moment. So, blessed hour to a free time a day. But I do have, a couple Tolkien related projects maybe in the early stages. Of course, again, a chance to do research on site in Oxford is always inspiring, and there's always some really exciting discoveries to come of that.
I'm super jealous of you heading back to Oxford just in the summertime, being able to see the environs. And Andrew, you had asked prior to us starting this interview, he and I were chatting. Have you ever been to the site of the battle? Is that a place that you've visited? Peter, yourself, have you ever gone off and?
I'm sorry, no, I have not. Actually, one of my students over the winter term did make a pilgrimage and send me a shot of the great statue of Bergnath, sword upraised and everything. I'd love to visit. Maybe they'd give me the keys to the city or something like that.
They should.
Well, it's not a very big place. I actually live in Essex.
Right,
Sadly, I haven't been there either.
They should.
But I would really like to go, because one of the things that you talked about earlier, it's still there. You can actually see pretty much where the battle was, and the causeway. Even though I think there's a road across it now, so it's twice as wide as it was, and obviously it'd be quite easy for Vikings to wander across the road nowadays. But you can actually see that the whole place. And it's unusual, because an awful lot of battles in England and Scotland and nobody really knows where they were. It's virtually impossible to try and actually work out where a battle took place, because it's just in sort of an area, so it's near Maldon somewhere. Right. This one, you can work it out because of the tide and where the river was. There's only a certain real place it could be. So it's actually quite nice to actually go somewhere and actually know it really probably really was where the battle took place.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. We settle for a little dramatic reading, usually on the Port Meadow in Oxford for my class. But yeah, it'd be wonderful to get to travel more. It's obviously a logistical headache. Nice to do a class with a sort of home base where we're not on the bus or on the train every other day. But sure, there's a lot of great Tolkien related sites that I have not had a chance to visit, and would love to find time for. Oddly enough, I've never been to Milwaukee to the Marquette Archives. I find that incredibly inconvenient to get up.
Yeah, it's I have not either, and I'm jealous of everyone who has made it there. I've had a chance to visit Oxford a little bit, but not get into the Bodleian Reading Room or do any research there. Again, jealous of people who have had the time and availability to go do those sorts of things. It's but I think it's fairly important and useful how much research now can be done remotely and with more digital access times, and then with people like yourselves doing the research and editing to come out with such a fantastic book like the Battle of Maldon, which I enjoyed reading very much. I liked A Sense of Tales Untold as well. It was a fantastic read through. So it's very important as a fan myself to have access to the materials through you, sort of by proxy, to get the chance to experience some of these things that weren't published before or were very hard to come by, and are now more mainstream and more accessible. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, well, hey, thanks for the kind words, and certainly that is a sort of unique joy and pleasure, this kind of thing. Some people will tear it up as one of the classic cash grabs, and will blame it on Christopher Tolkien of all people, right? But it's a wonderful day to be able to share some of Tolkien's writing that hasn't really seen the light, at least since his lectures in the 1930s. And again, I do hope you'll find some real gems, even in some of the denser material in this volume.
It's a very highly recommended book. I have to say, it's very good.
Both of the books are highly recommended.
Yeah. Oh,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Your Sense of Tales Untold is up for the Mythopoeic Award again this year. That's
that's pretty cool.
Fantastic news and well deserving. I'm certain, just my own personal opinion, that Maldon will also do the awards nomination rounds in the years to come. It's important, I think, for Lord of the Rings Hobbit fans to get a peek behind the curtain in these different ways with these volumes that connect Tolkien's scholarly work and his background as a philologist and the Old English and Middle English pieces that inspired him, and to see these different ways that they connect from different perspectives. There have been other works done on the Homecoming of Bjornoth, but seeing it here in the framework that you've put it is a very useful contribution to Tolkien studies.
Thank you. I suppose it's obvious, but when you were asking about the importance of Homecoming and the wider view, of course, I think it's the most sort of obvious example of the way Tolkien worked, the way he operated, right? And this funny little sandwich of what we call it in my class, and I actually ask my students to produce something like it. That is something that's a hybrid text, something combining some critical and expository and creative writing all together. So, I mean, of course, that scholarship informs and enriches the Lord of the Rings, but it's on kind of full display in something like the Homecoming. So yeah, great to great to hopefully draw some new some new readership to that text. I mean, obviously, in the States anyway, the Battle of Maldon is not something you're reading on a high school syllabus. So to have a little, even a sort of workmanlike prose translation here, I think has some value and some use. It allows you to see some of what Tolkien was drawing from that poem and sort of using in really exciting ways in his drama.
Yeah, absolutely. Any further questions, Andrew, Chad? I think it's been fantastic having you here. I myself have really enjoyed having our little chat.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I say it's an area that I think people who like the Lord of the Rings would really like this, particularly going through this and seeing, well, this is where I recognise bits of this in the Lord of the Rings. This is, I wish you can do a lot. It's great.
Yeah, and I know I said earlier in the interview, but I was surprised, pleasantly surprised at how easy of a read both of the books are. Like sometimes you get books like this and they're not easy to read, or they're not but these two books are quite easy to read, especially since of Tales Untold. How everything fits together is fantastically edited. I would definitely recommend getting both of these volumes.
Thank you, guys.
Great having you. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much. Good luck with the site, and I hope to be in touch soon. Thank you all.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thanks.